Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the UDC Library webinar, Get Better Pics Photography Tips. My name is Megan Kowalski, and I am the UDC Library's Outreach and Reference Librarian. Today's session, we're going to cover photography tips, just that. It is being recorded, and we will have time for questions, both recorded and unrecorded at the end of today's session. But at any point, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to pop that in the chat. I will be monitoring it throughout today's webinar. So first things first, this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the importance of photography. Why do we take pictures? We're also going to cover skills to practice and techniques to use to improve your photographs. And that will be the bulk of today's presentation. And we'll wrap things up with how to best use all of these photos you are taking, because pictures are no good if they are just stuck on your memory card. And so I love this quote from Dustin Sparks. A photograph is an opportunity to keep a moment forever. And this means a lot to me. I'm a mom of a 5-year-old. They move fast, the years move fast, and sometimes the best way to capture that is to take a picture. And the best picture is the one you take. Keep that in mind. A picture does not have to be perfect to be best. It is better to capture a photo than to not capture it at all. You also want to remember that today's session, we're going to cover taking photos, and that can be, whether you have a fancy DSLR camera or a phone. Most of my photos are taken with my phone. And so what do you use to take pictures the most? I can almost guarantee you that it is going to be the phone. So the best camera is the one you have with you in the moment. In this session, we'll mention some fancy camera stuff, but it will mostly be techniques you can use on your phone, because that is what the vast majority of us have and what the vast majority of us use. But when it comes to taking pictures, the best thing you can do is take lots of them. Practice, practice, practice. The more photos you take, the better you get. And so let's move on to taking those photos, and doing a little prep work can make your pictures better. And so before you start taking photos, ask some questions. What is your end goal? You need to know why you're taking the picture. What are you trying to photograph? Photographing people is different from animals, is different from inanimate objects. Photographing an event is different from photographing, just something you would see while going out for a walk. What are your photos intended to do? Is this something for you, just so you can revel in the moment and that memory? Or is this something you have an end goal of putting in a brochure or an online publication? And then where will those pictures be used? Is it going to be online? Is it going to be in a print publication? Is it going to be still used in a video? All of these matter. To best use your pictures, you have to know the quality and the idea of the image to help you frame the photos you are going to take at any given time. You might also want to think about composition. The end goal is going to depend on, are you shooting horizontally or are you shooting vertically? And this will let you know, if I know I'm going to use this as an Instagram post, nowadays they want you to post still pictures as verticals. But if you're capturing something you later want to mount on your wall, maybe you want to use something horizontal to fill that space. So planning is important. Sometimes you do have to act in the moment to get pictures, and so just take lots of them. Memory these days is cheap. Just take as many photos you can as you go. And so here are a few things you want to consider before you take pictures. This is mostly for work-related stuff, but it can also be useful in personal, shots. If you're doing an event ahead of time that, it's a family reunion, or even it's Christmas. Those holiday events tend to have things you can plan for. So first is you might want to consider a shot list. This is literally a list of pictures you need to capture and the style you want to take. So do you need close-ups? Do you need profile photos? Do you need to focus on details? Headshots, group shots, scene setting, whatever it is you might want to capture. Literally list out what you want to get so you don't miss anything. You don't need to do this for every event, but if you know you're doing something, it can be useful to have that list to go for. And this can be useful for recurring or special events that you might be doing if this is for work. You might also want to, what I call CYA, cover your ass. Again, this is really good if you're taking pictures for work, and you might want to think, of the legal ramifications. Do you need written permission? If you're working in an organization that might be working with minors, you might need permission from the parents to take those children's pictures. And so think about, what is the ultimate end goal of these photos? What are the legal ramifications? Do you need to worry about copyright? Is this work for hire? Keep those things in mind. You might also want to consider existing policies. If you're doing this for work, are there written policies you have to follow? But it could also be personally. Think of the end goal of that photo. Do you have a personal policy? So, for example, as I mentioned at the top, I have a 5-year-old, and sometimes I do like to post photos of her on either Facebook or Instagram. But my personal policy is that I never show her face. So if I know we're doing something, I make sure to capture a few photos that do not have her face in them. And then, be nice. There are general good rules to follow. Ask before taking pictures of people. Again, ask parents if you're photographing kids. Let people review and veto the photos if you have a plan to use them publicly afterwards. This only takes a few seconds, and it's better to just, ask permission first. And then do not take pictures of sensitive or personal information. Again, if you're doing this for work, you might want to consider things like, is there information on computer screens? Can you see ID cards? Any of that personal information? Make sure that's not included in the photo if this is something that is going to be used publicly later. And there are always other pictures to take. If someone says, please don't take my photo, don't push it, just back away and go somewhere else. You also want to prep your equipment. And so for your fancy camera or your DSLR cameras, first things first is you want to read the manual or watch the training videos. Any sort of camera manufacturer these days has training videos that they have created and released on their own platforms, but you can also find a plethora of stuff on LinkedIn Learning or YouTube. And this can go down to not just the make of the camera like a Nikon, but you consider the model in the year it was released as well. You also want to clean the lenses. If you use a dirty lens, you're going to get photos that have splotchiness to them or blurs, or they're just not going to focus right because there's something on the lens. And this may seem controversial. Turn off the flash. Most of the flashes that come with these cameras tend to be overly bright, and they give a weird sort of glare to people and objects within these photos. Now, if you want to go ahead and buy yourself a fancy adjustable flash, go ahead and do that, but it's not at all necessary. You also want to consider taking some test shots. So once you have your camera clean and prepped, take some photos just to see where's the lighting come from. Is there blur on the lens? Is there a streak on the lens I need to worry about? And then you're going to want to set mode. Are you taking a single photo because it's a posed situation? Or do you want to consider something like burst, where you can take 10 to 20 photos with one click of the button to get some action scenes? And depending on your camera, you're going to want to change things like shutter speed and how much light is let in. And again, the fancier the camera, the more settings there are. So again, read the manual and watch the training videos. Now, most of us are just going to be using a phone. So once again, turn off your flash. You're going to want to rely on natural light as much as humanly possible. You're also going to want to turn on grid lines. Every single phone camera has the option to turn on grid lines, and I'll talk about those later about why they are important. You're also going to want to consider adjusting the exposure. So depending on your camera, what you can do is click on what you're focusing on, and then you click and hold and drag up and down to change the amount of light that the lens captures. Again, you're going to want to consider, is this a still or a burst? Again, if lots of movement is going to be happening in these photos, use burst because you're capturing a lot of photos in one go. And also on your phone camera, you might want to consider, what camera am I using? Many of our phones these days come with 2, 3, I've even seen 4 and 5 lenses. So make sure you're using the right one. You don't want to use a zoom lens on something that's, broadly, out there, and you don't want to use a fisheye or a wide angle lens on something you're trying to get in detail. You're also going to want to consider some extras. So using a tripod, and again, they make all sorts of these for any kind of camera, both DSLRs and phone cameras. But you can also just consider, how can I stabilize my, camera. If you're using your phone and taking your hand, it's going to move around. So consider, can I lean this on a wall? Can I put it up against something? Can I just in some way find a way to stabilize my camera? You might also want to consider timers. And so you can set these on any sort of camera to be like, okay, if you need to be in the photo, what's the timer going to be? You might want to also consider having a remote. And this can be if you're working with multiple cameras in one situation, or if you simply want to be in the photo yourself, you can use a remote. You set the camera and then you use the remote to trigger the photo. You do have much less control of the shot since you're not looking through the viewfinder, but this can be useful in some situations. You're also going to want to prep your space. Situational awareness of the physical space of where you're going to take pictures is important because it sets the overall shot. So first things first, lighting. Lighting is key. It makes or breaks pictures. If the lighting doesn't work, neither will your picture. And so this is fancy. These are some words you might want to consider when you're, working with photography. The first is a key light, and this lights the main subject of your photo. So what is the main topic, the main point of your photograph? You want the key light on them. The fill light highlights the subjects and removes shadow. And so this is, it softens things. It makes it less stark. And then the backlight sets the subject apart from the background. And then you can have background lights that light the background, and the intensity of these depends on what you're working on. And all of this kind of lighting can be achieved naturally without equipment. You just need to consider the natural lighting in the area where you're taking photos. And you need to look for better lighting, not perfect lighting. So, there are some things you can do, simply as opening a window, or if you're photographing a person saying, hey, let's move closer to this window or under this overhead light, or, near this overhead light, move the subject around to get better lighting. Again, you're never going to achieve perfect unless you're in a studio situation, but you always want to look for better lighting. You're also going to want to consider white balance. And this is something that's mostly for DSLR cameras, but it can work for phones as well. And so white balance is making white look white. And this is particularly important when there's a mix of lighting, both natural and artificial. So if you're working inside and you've got fluorescent lighting, but you also have a window open, you're going to want to white balance things to make things, make the white look white. And basically why you do this is it keeps your main, subject of the photo from either looking orangey or too yellow or too blue. And that's because different lighting has different temperatures, and that changes how we view white. And you can set the balance of this in a fancy camera. Usually you do that by hitting the white balance button and holding up a white piece of paper, and it focuses on that white piece of paper. And phones often auto compensate for this. It's not perfect, but it does work. And when you're considering your lighting, again, natural is always better. It's just we as humans find it more pleasing. And so open blinds, lift shades, move things that might be blocking a window out of the way. You also want to move the objects or the subject into the light if at all possible. And the light should shine on your subject. Otherwise, they'll be backlit and create a silhouette, which can be good sometimes if that's the look you're going for, but always consider what's going on. And if you're shooting outdoors, you might want to consider doing so in the golden hour. And that's that bit of time where the sun is not so high on the horizon. It's generally the hour right before the sun fully sets and the hour after it starts to rise. So do keep that in mind. You're also going to want to consider glare. Is it on the lens of your camera? Like, is there a lens flare going on? Or is it on the objects you're trying to photograph? And this is especially important for people with glasses. You don't want to have light on the subject and then you can't see their eyes because it's glaring off their glasses. You're also going to want to consider reflections, light bouncing off of things. And this can leave a lot of weird ghosts in your photos. So you might think you're photographing a person and it's beautiful, but if you're doing it inside and the light is coming off and bouncing off of something else, you might see the weird shadow of a window behind them that's not actually there. You're also, again, going to want to consider shadows. Are there some areas of your photograph that look creepy or weird? Again, take your time and just adjust the lighting as necessary. You're also going to want to consider balance. And balance is the idea that a picture feels right. It's very much a vibe, but it matters in how our pictures turn out in the end. And this is from the golden ratio, and you get it from the Fibonacci spiral. So mathematically, it explains why things are pleasing to the eye. And so this is setting things according to how they fill the frame. And generally, you're following what's called the rule of thirds. And basically, you're setting the main subject slightly off center. We just find this mathematically pleasing to the eye. In balance, you're also going to want to consider white space or negative space. Empty is not bad. Empty is great. It lets the photo and the main subject of that photo have a sort of breadth to it. And so I want to show you why some of these things are important. So one way you can achieve balance is to move. And yes, that means moving the subject, but mostly it means moving yourself. So to get things started, first, here's a photo that I originally took a couple of years ago of my husband and my daughter. And it's an okay picture. You can see what's going on. They're at the beach. It's a cute photo of a husband and or my husband and my daughter. It's cute. But some things you might notice is my husband is on center. He's dominating the photograph. And as much as I love him, he's not the main point here. Also, what you've got going on is my daughter. She seems diminutive. I love her. I want her to be the key subject of this photograph. And another thing you'll might notice is there's a trash can in the background. And so this is something, it's just one photo. I took it, and because I do a lot of this, I noticed, okay, maybe it's time to change things up. And so I love that my mother-in-law got this photo of me. I moved, and look, I moved myself, I squatted down, and I changed the angle at which I was taking the photo. And so next, what we have is, you'll see, again, I'm squatting down, and what that does is changes the composition of the photo, and it changes the importance of what's going on there. So now, as much as I love my husband, he's still in the photo, but he's no longer the main subject. My lovely daughter is. She appears bigger in this. You still get a sense that she's a little girl, but she's now the main subject of the photo because the eye is drawn to her. And it was a nice little bonus that doing this, yes, the trash can is still there, but it's not as dominant. It's hidden more within the green and a little bit behind my daughter's elbow. So it's not as prominent a feature in the background. And so here are some best practices to consider when you're taking photos. And this is by no means everything, but it does consider the biggies. And it will, even including some of these, will improve your photographs. So first things first is you're going to want to create dynamic images. So consider your angle and your viewpoint. A lot of people just take a photo and that's it. They don't consider the overall composition. So when you're capturing something, either capture movement as it happens or create movement within the photograph by the angle at which you take the photo. And this means people and animals bring alive images because they have action to them and movement and life. So capturing them as your main subject is going to create some of these dynamic images. Or here, yes, we have people, but some of that dynamic part of this image is captured because what I did is I angled the camera over a staircase to look down, and you're sort of seeing this cascading bit of action of this library in Austin, Texas. You're also going to want to consider framing. So obviously frame the main subject, within the overall scope of your photo, but you can also use natural frames to direct the eye. So in this one, I literally took a window and a curtain to frame St. Peter's in the background. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to consider the golden rule of putting something, the golden ratio and putting something in the third quadrant. So here, yes, you have the curtain in the third quadrant, you also have St. Peter's. And so it creates this dynamic framing of the main subject. You're also going to want to consider distance. Are you too far away from your main subject? Don't be afraid to get closer. Fill the frame. Your subject should be the predominant feature in your picture. And in this case, my mom had befriended a little chipmunk in her yard and had fed it so often that this thing was pretty darn tame. And instead of, taking a photo from far away, I was able to just chill on the stoop and this was from a phone, very close to this subject. And speaking of distance, don't zoom. Optical zoom pixelates. Yes, if you have a DSLR camera with lots of fancy lenses, you can zoom because what you're doing is you're changing, how those lenses refract, but particularly on a camera, avoid zooming at all possible because at some point you're no longer zooming your lens, you're zooming through pixels and the image pixelates and becomes blurry, which means you can't use it in many print variations or even online. Things are just going to look a little less good. So move yourself or move the subject of the photo. I did not zoom in on this image. It's a statue at the Galleria Borghese. I literally walked as close to the statue as I was allowed to be and held my camera up. And I was just using a phone here to capture this bit of detail that I wanted. If you, again, have a super fancy lens, zooming is probably okay, but most phone camera lenses don't cut it. Yes, you can buy those tack-on lenses, but again, you're gonna end up optical zooming and they just make things seem fuzzier. You're literally going to wonder what is the subject of your image if you don't focus. If everything is in focus, then nothing is in focus. And so what are you focusing on in your photo? And by focus, I mean literally what is blurry and what is sharp and crisp. So on a camera, you can tap on the subject and that's where the phone will be like, okay, this is a subject. I'm going to make everything else blurry around it. And so your subject should be focused with a slightly blurry everything else. Because again, if everything is in focus, it's hard to know what the focal point of a photograph is. You might also want to consider trying portrait mode. And I know this is a feature on iPhones. I'm not quite sure of other things. And this essentially says it sees a face and it puts the face in focus and everything else gets a lot blurrier. And so this can be useful if you're taking portraits of people, but you can also use it on other subjects as well. And speaking of subject, keep it simple. Have one main idea per image. Yes, you can try to capture everything, but then your main idea is this is in a scene setting. Keep your idea simple. What is going to make this photo interesting? And frame that as the main character. So in this case, I was at a wine tasting and over to the side, there was someone chopping off hunks of dough to make baguettes. And yes, I could have captured a much bigger thing looking at the giant dough ball that was right there, the bag of flour, the loaves of bread he had already captured if I wanted to do everything. But what was most interesting in that moment is he had done this so many times. He was literally talking to me, not looking down. And so I wanted to capture how his hands were working. So consider that. Consider focusing on one main subject. You're also going to want to look at exposure, and this is how bright and dark your images are. And you can adjust this in the settings, but it's easier to do when taking the picture than it is in editing. So consider this ahead of time. And again, for most phones, you tap and drag on the screen to adjust how much light is coming in. Overexposure is when something is too light, and this can be used to blow out light sources on purpose, but it can also get you lens flare. And again, if that's the look you're going for, go ahead and use it. You're also going to want to consider the background. So Gestalt is a nice German word, and it means an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. For example, if you're outside taking photos, the Gestalt of taking a photo of someone in front of tree branches, it might look like they have antlers and instead of just a person standing in front of a tree. And this is also why the idea in libraries of book face is so fun because, haha, that book is attached to that person and we're seeing a full subject. And so when you're looking at the background, consider, will it distract from the main subject? Does it make it look junky? The background should enhance your photo or be neutral. Should not distract from the main point of your photo. You're also going to watch the line. And this is the idea of leading lines. It's a compositional technique used to guide the viewer through the photograph. Where does the eye travel in the photograph? And this can be explicit lines and paths or composed of negative space. You don't want to overwhelm the eye when you're looking at a photo. You want to guide it. So here I literally use some stairs to guide the viewer's eyes up to the tree, to the building, to the sky. It's leading the viewer from the bottom of the photograph to the top. You also want to consider the overall, again, balance. Sometimes you want something that's very symmetrical. And this is why accidentally Wes Anderson is its whole thing. We like the symmetry and the balance because they are pleasing to us. Asymmetry is also good, but that asymmetry also has to be balanced. So you might have something heavy on one side balanced by empty negative space on the other. You want composure in a photograph, not chaos. And this helps you enhance patterns and details within an image. You're also going to want to consider branding. If you're taking pictures for work, or if you're trying to drive a personal narrative, getting that idea of a cohesive Instagram grid. So, what's your brand? If you're working for an organization, is there an actual style guide you have to follow? But also, you want to create your own style of photography in terms of colors and saturation and the kinds of lighting you use and the image style you want to capture. Do you focus mostly on candids or do you like pose stuff? Are you photographing people and not things or just pets? Consider what your overall image style is because your style is how you speak through your photos. And this can take some time to figure out. So just play around with it until you find something where you're like, yes, this is me. This is who I am as a photographer. You're also going to want to edit lightly once you do have your photographs. Don't use filters. I know when Instagram first started, I went crazy with filters. Everybody did. But this day and age, when you're trying to do photography, don't use filters. You're going to want to possibly straighten things in editing. And this is good for things like horizons or straight lines because the eye wants level. You also might want to adjust for brightness and contrast. Again, do it lightly and adjust for saturation because sometimes the light coming in, the photo just looks a little bit off. So you can adjust for saturation. And you might want to adjust for warmth, make something feel a little bit more human, particularly if you're photographing people, making sure the skin looks like, that person was very healthy when you took that photo. And the end goal is to make the picture look real and not edited. I know that's weird, but that's why you want to adjust slightly. Again, though, if your branding style is to do heavily edited, go ahead and do that. Again, these are just best practices. You don't have to follow all of them. And I do want to talk briefly about photographing people. And this is mostly for portraits and headshots. So, first, focus on the face. If we're photographing people, focus on the face. You want light in their eyes, get that glimmer or spark of life. And this can be achieved, through natural lighting. You don't need to have special lights for this. You also tend to want to be head on. So, if you get a photo from below, that's a nostril shot. Slightly above or looking straight on, you tend to get a strong jawline, which just sets the face apart from everything else. You also want to frame the eyes in about the top third of the image. Again, getting back to that idea of balance and the rule of thirds. And again, background matters, particularly with people. You don't want to distract. Having a blurry background is great. You also want to avoid what I like to call the DMV composition. So maybe have your subjects slightly turn their shoulders or tilt their head or add a little bit of torso. The DMV or the passport photo where they're not smiling and it's just a headshot, it feels weird. And so consider these things. And on the screen, I chose this photo because it is both good and bad. What is good about it is my face and eyes are well lit. It's not a DMV post. There's no nostril gazing. The background shows what is happening. The bad thing here is you can't see my husband's face. And to fit the field in the background, our faces are far too low within the photograph. So again, these things happen. And here are a couple extra things you might want to keep in mind. So when you're taking photos, what do you want to, take a photo of? It can be ordinary or it can be extra. Everyday things are just as good as special things because you taking the photo is what makes it special and worth capturing. You might also want to consider candid first composed. Both have their place and use each with a purpose. So candids are livelier and more natural. Their less formal composure here is actually something you want. Influencer photos are composed photos meant to feel like candid. They never are, and everyone knows it. Those people, oh, I'm just walking down the street. No, we know that's fake. But that's a whole brand, and that's okay. So just consider when you're taking a photo, are you going for candid here? Or are you going for composed? Take lots of pictures. Photograph the same thing in multiple ways. Again, memory is cheap. The delete button is free. So go ahead and take these as many pictures as you want. You're also going to want to review your images, not just for how you're going to use them, but to get better. So, what do you like? What works? What doesn't work? What would you have done differently? When you do this self reflection, it helps improve who you are as a photographer because you start to learn from what you've done in the past and how it did or did not work. And back up your photos. I cannot state this enough. Get your photos off your phone. If you drop this in the toilet, you're going to be so sad you lost everything if you didn't have auto backup set. On an iPhone, yes, you have iCloud, but you also have a ton of other third-party platforms you can use. I personally use Amazon Photos because I like having everything in one spot, but back up your photos, not just on your phone, but on your memory cards. And the best practice is to have a copy on the cloud, a copy on the computer, and depending on, how important these are, you might want to have something on a third place. So like a hard drive you keep in a firebox. So for example, my wedding photos are backed up to the cloud. They're backed up to my computer. They're backed up to my husband's computer, and they are on a hard drive within a firebox. And so these are some things you want to consider. Save your photos. Please back them up multiple times. And so now that you have all of these lovely photos, what do you do with your pictures? Well, you know, everyday sharing. You can text them, put them on social media, email, basically any basic way you want to share your photos with others. Go ahead and do it. It's very easy. You can also consider digital displays and art. So if you're doing this for work or even at home, digital photo screen, TV screensavers, computer backgrounds, any place you can put a digital photo, just think, maybe I could put a picture there. You might also want to consider what I would call exhibits. So make a web portfolio, start a Substack or another newsletter. Again, you're professionalizing the personal. If you happen to work for an organization that has the ability to do an online exhibit, go ahead and do it there. You also can make a lot of stuff with your photos. So calendars, print calendars, or online calendars. You can make books. I know people who make personal yearbooks with all the photos they've taken throughout the year. You can do prints, blow up big shots to hang on walls, or just, go to CVS and print out photos you can put on frames. You can put, photos on, basically name an object, you can put a photo on it these days. So coffee mugs, t-shirts, journals, anything you can possibly think of that you can print something on, you can put a photograph there. Most importantly, you want to enjoy. Taking pictures is fun. So take your camera or phone for a walk and just take pictures of all the things that make you happy. And so here are some resources. Read the wrong way. Here are some resources. I will send these out with the link to today's recording. There's a golden hour calculator that helps you figure out on any given day of the year where you are geographically, what that golden hour is. Pixlr is an online editing platform. GIMP, again, is a great place for photos. Lightroom and Photoshop are ways you can edit your photos. And Canva, not only can you edit your photographs, but you can print them on many, many things as well. Some references you might want to consider. These are various books and some articles that are worth reading. And so I want to thank you for attending today. And I do want to say it's always fun to capture other photographers at work. So there was one time my husband and I were on vacation. We were enjoying a glass of wine, and we just happened to be at this spot at a railing that overlooked the Bay of Naples and Mount Vesuvius or Mount Etna. And just seeing these Instagram photo shoots happening, some would be composed, some tourists would just get up there and hold selfies of themselves. Some people are just taking a photo of the mountain itself. And we spent a good hour there, just people watching people taking photos. Photography is fun, so have fun with it. And so now I'm happy to take any questions you might have, both recorded and unrecorded. Again, thank you for attending today. The link to today's session will go out once I get it posted to YouTube this afternoon. All right, not seeing any questions come in, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.